I'm Warren Sprouse. You're on the Bible Forum. I'm glad you're here. Every Sunday night from 8 to 10 p.m. live. You can interact with the chat room. Have you ever heard of critical race theory? Well, you have, unless you've been living under a rock someplace. Critical race theory is what universities and others are using to change our social political structure. This is not my opinion. This is not a political opinion. This comes from the Britannica.com. Contemporary racial theory is the child of critical race theory, and most Americans do not agree with its ideological claims. However, it's being pushed strongly by elites and has entrenched itself in special interests in many public institutions. Broadly defined, critical race theory utilizes race as the lens through which every area of life is examined, categorizing everyone into either oppressor or oppressed groups. And it depends on your race. Now, they mean skin color, they mean national origin. All human beings belong to the same race. We're all Homo sapien. All the parts are interchangeable. Come on, guys. CRT is a framework in jurisprudence that examines society and culture as they relate to categorizations of race, law, and power in the United States. It began as a movement in American law schools in the mid to late 1980s as a reworking of critical legal theory on race issues. As the word critical suggests, both theoretical frameworks are rooted in critical theory, a social philosophy, which argues that social problems are influenced and created more by societal structures and cultural assumptions than by individual and/or psychological factors. It's loosely identified by two common themes. One is that white supremacy exists and exhibits power maintained over time, and in particular that the law plays a role in that process. Secondly, that transforming the relationship between law and racial power, as well as achieving racial emancipation and anti-subordination more broadly, are possible. Lindsay Burke, director of the Center of Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, noted in her remarks that among the most influential arenas where critical race theory is being furthered is through the approximately 14,000 public school boards across the country. Tommy Curry, associate professor of philosophy at Texas A&M University. Curry's contributions to Sage Publications, Encyclopedia of Race and Crime, 2009, formed the basis of the following contributions. He says, quote, critical race theory is the view that the law and legal institutions are inherently racist and that race itself, instead of being biologically grounded and natural, is, well, racist. He maintains that it's a socially constructed concept that is used by white people to further their economic and political interests at the expense of people of color. According to critical race theory, racial inequality emerges from the social, economic, and legal differences that white people create between the races to maintain elite white interests in labor markets and politics, giving rise to poverty and criminality in many minority communities. Are you getting the picture? White people are responsible for black crime, whether they know it or not. No? Then you don't understand critical race theory. But of course, you're not alone. Most Americans wouldn't even agree with its ideological claims. However, many of those on school boards are approving the use of the curriculum materials based on the 1619 Project, which is a series of articles published by the New York Times that frames the arrival of African slaves on the shore of the United States as the central feature of the American founding. Not the Pilgrims, which predated slavery, not the Christians who came, but the slavers who brought black men and women, children over here to work. Their view stands in stark contrast to the idea that this nation was birthed at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. Prior to that, there were colonies all up and down the eastern seaboard. Some justified slavery. A few shipped them in from Africa. But most did not. And they weren't really a cohesive element. They were not united. All of this with no mention of Islamic slavery, which was far more insidious and widespread and continues to this day in some parts of the world. Mauritania is one of those places. Legally banned slavery, but it's still active. Sudan, African women and children are slaves, largely because they're Christians in a Muslim nation. Nigeria, former President Obama's wife, Michelle, highlighted the slave raids into that country just a few years ago. Remember Boko Haram? It's still going on. Algeria, sub-Saharan Africans are being enslaved by Algerians. It's estimated 106,000 of them. So why do we ignore all this? Did you see that on Fox News tonight? Did you see that on the mainstream media? Are we being told about this? No. We're ignoring it, we're told, because it's expedient. TheFederalist.com. We're busy with our own problems and apparently don't want to open this can of worms. What's the can of worms? Largely, it's about Islam. All the nations I mentioned are in North Africa. It's Islamic. Not my opinion. This is an article written by Charles Jacob, president of the American Anti-Slavery Group. Copyright 2021 by The Federalist. Today, more than 4,500 classrooms around the country have begun to incorporate the 1619 Project curriculum materials into their content. The data collected by the 1619 Project showed that only 25% of parents and 17% of school board members believe that students should be taught that the founding ideals of liberty and equality were false when they were written, and that U.S. history must thus be reframed. 25% of the parents, 17% of school boards, not a majority. But every government school in our nation is teaching it. Jonathan Butcher, a senior policy analyst at Heritage, explained that what the critical race theory worldview does is dismantle social and governmental norms. What it does is foment a new kind of intolerance. Critical theory is not a sympathetic perspective with policy goals that lead to racial reconciliation, freedom, and opportunity. It's talking about contemporary subjugation and retribution, he said, referencing a paper he co-authored with fellow panelist and author Mike Gonzalez. A group of Southern Baptist Seminary presidents released a statement declaring that critical race theory is incompatible with their beliefs and denounced it as racism. The statement sparked an outrage among some within the Southern Baptist Convention, forcing at least 2 black pastors to cut ties. Now, I can only surmise that the outrage was against the report, not the racism that it exposed. The CRT movement officially organized itself in 1989 at the first annual workshop on critical race theory, though its intellectual origins go back a whole lot farther. It goes back to the 1960s and 70s. The launch of CRT, critical race theory, marked its separation from something called critical legal studies, an offshoot of critical theory that examined how the law and legal institutions function to perpetuate oppression and exploitation. Instead of drawing theories of social organization and individual behavior from continental European thinkers such as G.W.F. Hegel, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud. Critical, CLS, and feminist jurisprudence had done. CRT was inspired by figures such as Martin Luther King, W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, Black Panthers, Frantz Fanon, a Marxist, humanist psychiatrist from the French West Indies. Are you getting the picture? You do who Malcolm X was, right? Black Panthers? Okay. Critical race theory advanced theoretical understandings of the law, politics, and American sociology that focused on the efforts of white people, Euro-Americans, to maintain their historical advantages over people of color. CRT has spread beyond the confines of legal studies to many other fields, notably women's and gender studies, education, American studies, and sociology. CRT spin-off movements formed by Asian American, Latinx, and LGBTQ scholars have all taken hold. From thechristianpost.com comes a different approach, same issue, same ideas. In a webinar hosted by the Heritage Foundation's Angela Saylor Monday, policy experts spoke at length about the ways in which critical race theory and the identity politics it underpins have sown hostile division into public life while claiming to combat racial injustice. Broadly defined, she says, critical race theory utilizes race as the lens through which every area of life is to be examined, then categorizing the people into either an oppressor or an oppressed group. The racial theory is the child of critical theory, the scholars explain, and most Americans do not agree with its ideological claims. However, it is being pushed strongly by elites and has entrenched itself in special interests in many public institutions. Largely, I might add, without our knowing about it. Lindsay Burke, who's director of the Center of Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, noted in her remarks that among the most influential arenas where critical race theory is being furthered is in local school boards. There are approximately 14,000 public school boards across the country. These boards indelibly shape the minds of school children, and many are approving the use of the curriculum materials based on the 1619 Project. More than 4,500 classrooms around the country have begun to incorporate the 1619 Project curricular materials into their content, she said. Burke and her colleagues specifically asked school board members and families across the country about 1619 Project. And 50% of all parents, 70% of all school board members said they do not want schools to use instructional materials rooted in the idea that slavery is the center of the national narrative. Likewise, 70% of parents, 74% of school board members believe that slavery is a tragedy that harmed the nation, but that freedom and prosperity represent who Americans are. Their data showed that only 25% of parents, 17% of school board members believe that students should be taught this stuff. Jonathan Butcher, a senior policy analyst at Heritage, explained that what the CRT worldview does is dismantle social and governmental norms to foment a new kind of intolerance. Critical theory is not a sympathetic perspective with policy goals that lead to racial reconciliation, freedom, opportunity. It's about subjugation and retribution. He talked about this referencing a paper he co-authored with fellow panelist and author Mike Gonzalez. These are the kinds of things that are happening while we're not paying attention. A whole generation of children growing up with a false narrative. What's that do?